Inventory therapy is a highly effective cognitive behavioral practice for the resolution of unresolved trauma. This video will guide you step by step through the process of inventory practice to achieve a better understanding of what causes trauma and why and how unresolved trauma influences our behavior and perception of ourselves and our personal effectiveness. To understand why inventory therapy is useful for the resolution of unresolved trauma, it is useful to understand briefly why and how abuse causes trauma. When we are children, we are often exposed to abuse triangulation, in which our parents or caregivers expose us unintentionally or intentionally to conflict between them. If there is conflict in a relationship, no two persons can easily contain the tension between them, and third persons are often drawn into the conflict. When this person is a child, we become traumatized by exposure to that conflict, since we do not yet possess skills or boundaries for handling such experiences. And so this causes trauma and affects how we perceive ourselves, other people, and life around us. This worldview comes with us into adulthood and directly affects our ability to navigate life and its challenges, build and maintain relationships, and greatly increases fear, anxiety, and insecurity. The effects of childhood trauma and abuse lead to specific coping mechanisms and control mechanisms, which are described in the Karpman Drama Triangle model developed by Dr. Stephen Karpman. Like abuse triangulation, we develop one of three personality types in response to abuse in order to cope with the stress of trauma, which Dr. Karpman describes as the persecutor, victim, and rescuer, but I've come to find that the word helper is a more useful descriptor of the latter, and use that term in this video and my work instead of rescuer. Each personality type within the Karpman Drama Triangle model is defined by specific coping and control behaviors, which can make it easy to recognize that which we identify. And it is important to recognize which we identify because it can help us understand why we behave the way we do in response to stress, which is a function of human biological psychology and not our own choices or individuality. As a persecutor, for instance, we have learned to respond to the stress of trauma by adopting arrogance and are often entitled or blame others for their problems or our problems, specifically if they get in the way of our success or desires. We are often obstinate and frequently the type who refuses to say sorry or make amends for the hurt we cause others. Marked by outward displays of strength, we are sometimes, but not always, charismatic. We are also usually intransigent, which means we are unwilling to change our views or come to an understanding with others. This also makes us intolerant to people in our lives, and we attempt to actively control others through coercion and force, controlling their access to others or resources in order to make them do as we wish. As persecutors, we are usually an active perfectionist, obsessively or excessively engaging goals and tasks. The victim type is the polar opposite of the persecutor and defined by a belief that we are weak and incapable of getting for ourselves that which we desire or need, with our personality being dominated by excessive fear and self-pity. This is not the term victim in the sense of being a victim of a crime or trauma, but of having a mindset and personality identity which is fixated on our perceived weaknesses and helplessness. Fearing our perceived inability to handle mistakes, even when it is as simple as choosing between flavors of ice cream, but especially larger problems like handling finances or dealing with romance, leads to indecisiveness and pronounced anxiety. Each identity is codependent on the others because our particular worldview cannot be fulfilled without those which fit into our perceptions of life. But as a victim type, we display more obvious dependent behaviors such as excessive neediness. Because we feel dependent on the strength of others, we fear losing them and thus utilize passive control behaviors instead of force or coercion, and leverage language, shame, and guilt to make others do what we wish. Believing ourselves incapable of success, we also deal with perfectionism by avoiding goals or tasks in which we believe perfection is not possible. If we have a helper identity, we derive our purpose and value from being involved in the conflicts which occur between those who are persecutors and victims. Helper types are often, but not always, middle children, which felt invisible and ignored unless we actively inserted ourselves into the abuse triangulation occurring between our siblings and parents, thusly being conditioned to see our value only when we are of use to others and participating in conflict. The problem arises that if we are actually useful to others and successfully resolve conflict and trauma, they are no longer dependent on us, for which our identity is likewise dependent. So our behavior is in fact subversive and duplicitous and actually serves to engender and sustain trauma, doubt, and conflict, though we try to characterize or present it as advocacy or allyship. Thus, those who are helpers are often politic. engaging in both sides' mediation even when there are clear antagonists and villains. As helpers, we become condescending and engage in gossip, which helps to fuel conflict triangulation. We are often enablers, which facilitate self-destructive behavior in others and meddlesomely insert ourselves into conflict or opportunistically exploit situations for our participation where it is not required. Because sustaining conflict requires stratagem, we are also inconsistent and change our position or opinion to whichever serves our function, and not that which is actually healing to others. Control for a helper would betray our dependency on others, so we instead use defensiveness as a primary control behavior, exploiting any and all forms of criticism or conflict directed at us back onto those around us. Like the persecutor and victim, the helper is also burdened by perfectionist standards, but exploits the absence of perfection in others to distract from our own inability to achieve it. The characteristics predominant in each type are not limited to each, but are instead the most prominent identifiers and are most obvious in the context of close personal relationships. The purpose of these identifiers is not to criticize or attribute labels to others, but to instead understand human psychology as we try to address and resolve our own experiences of trauma. One unifying trait of all three types is defensiveness, which is the universal defensive mechanism because we feel incapable of handling criticism or scrutiny, which triggers insecurity and memories of trauma. The characteristics of each identity are actually tools we use to navigate life and handle conflict, and when those tools are criticized by others, our very ability to cope with life feels threatened. So defensiveness is the most prominent coping mechanism which results from experiences of trauma and abuse triangulation. Any defensiveness indicates that inventory therapy is mandatory. Inventory therapy is effective specifically because the act of writing communicates with the unconscious, and the structured practice assists the unconscious mind to understand trauma and learn new and healthy coping behaviors, which then automatically replace those which were not helpful. This practice is an act of self-care, taking time and making effort to address past trauma and resolve its burden on our psyche. It is a process of learning in which we teach ourselves new life skills and healthier coping behaviors. The learning of these new skills results in better effectiveness and a newfound sense of empowerment, which reduces stress and cultivates confidence. Our primary caregivers during childhood were often themselves burdened by trauma and abuse, and so not possessed of effective, healthy life skills, so they could not teach them to us. We cannot, after all, give what we do not have, and even parents who try their best cannot avoid causing some trauma and abuse to their children due to the complexity of human psychology and limitations of mortality. So this practice helps us teach ourselves that which our parents or caregivers could not. This practice is not an exercise in self-criticism, and mistaking introspection for criticism can easily interrupt this practice and prevent effective resolution of past trauma. Self-pity is often used as a cudgel to control and shame others, but self-pity is a coping mechanism to find value in ourselves when none is forthcoming from our environment. Contrary to destructive ideas of personal worth, we cannot willingly adopt confidence, which instead comes from lived experiences. And trying to adopt confidence when we do not have it is not confidence, but in fact arrogance. It can be difficult to understand the difference between confidence and arrogance, but arrogance denies weakness and vulnerability, where confidence accepts weakness and vulnerability. Self-pity is simply a survival tool which helps us cope with the pain of our trauma, and the opposite of self-pity is not denying it, but instead having compassion for ourselves and recognizing that it is a coping mechanism which has helped us to survive the stress of childhood trauma, but which is unhelpful as an adult, and during this practice, self-compassion should replace self-pity. There are two parts to the inventory therapy, the first of which is referred to as the personal inventory. In this part, we write down our past experiences of trauma, abuse, disappointment, pain, loss, resentments, and conflicts, anything which causes consternation or the mind to ruminate. A good way to determine whether something should be written down in the personal inventory is any and all thoughts which cause us stress. There are 5 columns in the personal inventory. The first is resentment, under which we write a simple identifier for the source of our problem. These can be anything from individuals and groups of people to ideas or institutions, or simply just life itself. Many of us dislike the word resentment and like to forgive others and try to let go of resentments. But for the purpose of this practice, a resentment is anything that occupies the mind, causes us stress, or is a source of trauma, loss, disappointment, frustration, pain, etc. Instead of considering the definition of resentment, write in this column whatever is the source of trauma or stress which is being identified. Some examples are parents, siblings, friends, a partner, ex-partner, boss, or coworker, politicians, schools, government, taxes, pain, injury, wild animals, the dark, bugs, spiders, conflict, etc. We can have resentments for food, health, or disease, weight gain, cancer, money, banks, taxes, responsibilities, children, marriage, and even death or conditions of life. For most people, our parents or other caregivers during our childhood will take up the bulk of our personal inventory because our caretakers were the most prominent and continuous presence during our formative years. What is not helpful in this column is to list someone like mom or dad or a religion or other source of trauma and then enter everything they have done to us as one single entry. When we do this, we fixate on the source of our trauma rather than the behavior, which is what actually hurt us. And if we do that, it is more difficult to understand why we were hurt, which then makes it difficult to understand how we can heal. So it is more effective to instead write down each individual event, behavior, or cause separately, and to write the source of the trauma in resentment each time we write a separate entry. The second column is cause, and here we write all the contributing factors to this particular entry. The cause can be as simple as what happened, that someone said or did something to us, or we lost something, or were hurt in some manner, and all the particular events which unfolded. But the cause can also be as complex as the pain and emotions we feel or felt in relation to this experience, or prior psychological pain or conditioning which made us vulnerable to the experience. Some examples can be things like someone yelling at us or hurting our feelings, which could also include how we were taught to think of ourselves as children, which is relevant to the particular hurt. It can be something like a disease that makes us unhealthy and impairs our ability to function physically, but also that we were maybe taught in our youth that disease is bad. If a resentment is against our boss, the cause might be that they are critical, overbearing, rude, or don't pay us as much as we are worth. But it can also be that we find conflict or criticism to be stressful also, and that we have been conditioned to neglect our own well-being in service to authority, or that our boss's behavior reminds us of experiences from our childhood when our parents or other authority figures treated us in similarly harmful ways. One of the most common coping mechanisms for experiences that are demoralizing, traumatic, or frustrating is that we try to move on or outright ignore or minimize our experience in order to cope with it. But this actually gives those experiences more power over us, not less, since we are ignoring it. So this column is useful because it helps us to better understand what is actually going on when we have such experiences, and why it is helpful to try and understand all possible causes. This might be difficult at first, but proficiency will come with practice. So don't worry if you can't understand all at first. Simply spend enough time in each of the columns identifying all possible contributing factors. Entries can always be revisited and redone if they are not fully effective the first time, and some traumas are so deep and complex that they will require multiple entries to fully understand. The third column is the parts of self which are hurt by this resentment. Because human life requires certain resources and experiences for us to feel safe and fulfilled, the denial of these needs is when we experience trauma. And because we are a human being subject to the laws of mortality, we do not get to decide those needs, which are instead decided by life and human biology. Examples of human needs are things like food and nutrition, shelter, love, both platonic and erotic, belonging, opportunity, safety, and fulfillment. So in this column, we choose which parts of the self are affected by this particular entry, and not those which we arbitrarily invent. The list of choices are self-esteem, pride, emotional security, financial security, personal relations, sex relations, and ambitions. Some are self-explanatory, but for instance, a resentment for something which has affected our financial security can also affect our emotional security, because we need money to buy food or afford shelter, and those things also bring us emotional security. Harassment by peers can affect our emotional security because we require inclusion, friends, and social integration to feel safe in our lives, but that also obviously affects our personal relations. If we planned to do something during the day or intended for our child or partner to do something, but they didn't, that would affect our ambitions as well as our personal relations, because our ambitions were that something should happen and it did not. The entry here can be any or all of the list, but only these options which specifically encompass parts of the self required for the fulfillment of human life. The fourth column, my part, is how we contributed or continued to contribute to the resentment. For instance, if the resentment entry is against our partner for an argument we had, we write in my part what we did and said, and in the cause column we write what they did and said. This column encompasses only our actions and choices, and the purpose of this column is not self-judgment or self-criticism, but a sober analysis of our actions and choices, to help our mind better understand how we can and do affect our experiences, as opposed to the ways in which we are affected by our experiences. Many resentments occurred during childhood, and because children are entirely dependent on parents or other caregivers, we do not usually have a part in resentments which occurred during childhood. Many times our parents or abusers convinced us as children that we bear responsibility for the abuse we received. This is a harmful and destructive manipulation meant to relieve abusers of the responsibility of their actions and condition us as children to submit to abuse. In reality, we do not, as children, bear such responsibility because we are incapable of providing for our own needs. So entries in my part come only from when we are grown and have the autonomy of adulthood. Most of us try to control things we cannot actually control, while we neglect the things we actually can control because we feel powerless to do so due to the absence of effective life skills. The first three columns of the personal inventory show which parts of our lives we cannot control, while the last two columns shows those parts which we can. Better recognizing what parts of our life we can control helps us direct and focus our energies to that which we actually can control, and thus makes us more effective in our lives. Sometimes we might mistake emotions as something we can control and might be tempted to write something like, "I let them make me angry," or "I was upset." But emotions are actually hormones and are controlled by the endocrine system and the nervous system and are not actually within our control. If and how we choose to act on emotions is what is under our control, not the emotions themselves. And so it is only our actions and choices which go under my part, while emotions are always written under cause. The last part of the personal inventory is our character weaknesses. These are actually the specific control and coping mechanisms which arise from experiences of trauma and are weaknesses because they are ineffective. For instance, selfishness, dishonesty, fear, insecurity, or being overly serious causes us a great deal of stress and jeopardize relationships with others, as well as our quality of life. Because most of us feel powerless to handle life without these control and coping mechanisms, we might feel resistance to identifying them. But in reality, this is merely service to the ego, and we can and should identify our weaknesses in this safe space of self-care, so that we can stop allowing control mechanisms and trauma to dictate the course of our lives and our behavior. This can only occur by being self-honest and courageous and finding compassion for our trauma and pain, which is reflected in these survival mechanisms. All of us are trying our best, even if it isn't very good, and we only lack those life skills which are more effective alternatives to the character weaknesses identified in this column. Doing so can help our unconscious mind learn new strengths and life skills so that we can be more effective in our own lives. Simply recognizing our control and coping mechanisms in this column empowers the mind to be aware of this self-destructive behavior, and it will naturally cease as inventory therapy is completed. This is a sample of an inventory entry. In here, we have put down our boss as the sample. The cause might be something like they criticized my work. They make me worried about my job security or possibly being fired even though I work hard and actually do a good job. Other causes might be something like my parents often criticized me as a child even when I was good, and this situation makes me feel that same shame and fear. It could also be something like I was taught to sacrifice my own well-being for those in authority. Identifying these causes helps us understand how these experiences cause trauma. Under parts hurt, we might write self-esteem because we derive self-esteem from our abilities and usefulness. It also might affect our pride because work and responsibility bring a sense of accomplishment and confidence. Work obviously brings us money, so it would also affect our financial security, and it would also affect our ambitions since work is inherently an ambitious undertaking. The sample in my part might be something like I was doing my best, but it could also be something like I argued with my boss. Very often in my part, our part is taking part. So for instance, taking this job in the first place is part of my part. We could also always quit and work somewhere else, and choosing to continue in that position and be present in the presence of someone like a boss who abuses us is part of our part, separately from the abuse that we receive. Character weaknesses that might be revealed by this experience are such things as insecurity, being fearful, combative, defensive, avoidant, ungrateful, or overly serious. Underlying every resentment are fears which fuel insecurity and motivate destructive control and coping mechanisms. And the second and most important part of the inventory therapy is the fear inventory. Yes, fears make us uncomfortable, but avoiding it or ignoring fear gives it power over us. While this practice gives us the opportunity to confront and understand fears in a safe place instead of when we are confronted by those things in life. Better understanding the things we fear brings empowerment and resolves fear because fear is always caused by an absence of understanding, and this practice instead provides answers and understanding. The fear inventory is 4 columns, and in the first we simply write what it is we fear. In the second column, we write the cause, and much like the personal inventory, can be as simple as that thing we fear happens. But there are also other causes which are often psychological conditioning, such as that we learned in childhood. It is often the case that we fear things simply because we were told to, either from observing life around us, the feelings that trauma brought us, or instruction from parents or other authority figures. Many people are conditioned by life, family, and institution to fear death, but death is actually a necessary and special part of life that must happen to every living creature. It is the ultimate act of surrender by which we end our time on Earth, and without death, we would not even be a species here on this Earth. Death is often used also as a threat or contextualized as punishment, bad or shameful, even though we all must die, and fearing death, we try to pretend it doesn't happen, or is a long way off. And then as we age or experience loss and illness, grow more and more terrified by the prospect of death because we never took the time to properly consider our fear and other alternatives rather than simply trying to ignore them. Exploring those fears in this structured practice helps our unconscious mind shed those fears which were born in trauma to instead find comfort in the realities of life. Writing all the possible causes of our fear in the cause column can help us better understand why we have those fears. In the effects column, we write the way in which having this fear affects our lives, not how the thing we are afraid of affects our lives, but in having the fear itself. For instance, if we are inventorying a fear of death, we do not write what the effect of death is upon our lives, but what the effect of having the fear is upon our lives, which causes us to feel anxiety, to ignore it, to hurt our body trying to stay young, maybe losing sleep or having nightmares, or even ruin relationships and lose loved ones because of our fear. The effect of fear is often more harmful on our lives than those things of which we are afraid. And in reality, life is the greater part peaceful, wonderful, and exciting, but we fail to recognize that and fail to enjoy our life and find fulfillment because we spend most of our time overcome and driven by fear and anxiety. This results in debilitating psychological coping mechanisms like hypervigilance, anxiety, depression, ceaseless internal dialogue, or insomnia, as our mind constantly anticipates and expects the things we fear, even when they have never happened to us. Fear is a waste of emotional energy and distracts us from reality, and worst of all, makes us ineffective as we constantly try to prevent the things we fear, even when they never happen. And in the rare occasion they do, are even less effective in handling that trauma because we have never learned effective skills to handle reality. Identifying how fear affects our lives in this column helps the unconscious mind to recognize the burden that fear has on our lives and how unproductive, arbitrary, and unhelpful it actually is. In the better way column, we ask ourselves what is a better way to consider this thing of which we are afraid. This is a place to differently conceptualize that which we fear, because most fear comes from our conditioning, perspective, and ignorance, and not reality. Often people are tempted in this column to write how they can better control the thing that they are afraid of. For instance, if we have a fear of disease, we might write in this column that we can take better care of our health or eat better. This is not correct. That is us trying to control the thing that we fear, which we cannot actually do, no matter how much any of us desire. We cannot prevent death and aging, and fear of death and aging drives people insane and to do horrible things to their body, themselves, and other people in attempts to defy mortality. Instead, we differently conceptualize our fear. So in this column, we might write that aging and disease are a natural part of life and that we don't need to fear them, that we are probably a lot stronger than we give ourselves credit for. And because we are still alive, have dealt with disease before and know we don't need to be as worried about it as we usually are. Fears are also often rooted in the fear that we are alone and that our life is left only up to us. And that fear should be inventoried if you possess it. But that is not even remotely true, and we have the entire collective of humanity on Earth alongside us. Family, friends, social support groups, government, communities, social programs, and society that all can lend assistance if we need it. And we are not powerful enough to control fate, which is instead the domain of higher forces which shape the universe and place us here on Earth and guide the course of our lives. Most of our lives are not up to us, and adopting that responsibility for us is an incredible burden that most of us cannot bear, which is why it causes so much fear and anxiety. So considering a better way in terms of higher powers like fate and the universe, physics, God, whatever your conception is, will help you turn over responsibility for those things that are not actually within our responsibility. For instance, if we are afraid of going into a job interview, it is likely because we mistakenly believe it is our responsibility to make someone hire us. Like any aspect of life, when we go into an interview, our only job is to show up for opportunity and to do our best. We cannot determine the outcome nor make people hire us. So a better way to consider the fear of not getting hired is that it's not actually up to us whether we get hired. We don't need to make someone hire us or love us or accept us or praise us or help us. All we need to do is show up and do our best. And recognizing the limitations of our responsibility in a better way can help us turn responsibility for things we do not control over to those forces which do. Here is a sample of a fear inventory entry. For instance, we might have a fear of getting fired from our job. The cause of this fear might be that your boss criticized you and seems displeased with your work. So the possibility of being fired is a real one. Work could also be stressful and volatile. Also, very often, the things that we are afraid of are actually things that happen. So part of the cause is that people do get fired. And we also often need a job to earn money, to pay bills and afford food and housing and to live well. So the possibility of losing a job is something real that we may experience. Part of the cause could also be that your parents fought all the time about finances and you learn to fear financial instability and prioritize money and materialism. So those fears would also be relevant to this fear, as well as your conditioning as a child, which taught you how to perceive your own effectiveness and realities of life. The effect of having this fear, not the thing that you are afraid of, but having the fear itself, might be something like you're so stressed out at work and also at home constantly thinking about work and this fear. You may, in response to having this fear, work too many hours trying to appease a hateful and contemptuous boss, that you can't enjoy your family because your mind is always on work and your fear of being fired. Work also might not be rewarding because you're constantly afraid of being fired. And it could also be taxing on your health because fears often induce stress hormones and anxiety has direct consequences for our physical well-being. Under a better way, we consider a better way than having this fear in the first place, or fearing this thing that we are afraid of. Many people often try to write down ways in which they can try to control the fear, and that is not what this column is. This column is a different way to conceptualize the thing that you are afraid of. So for instance, opposite of being afraid of being fired, a better way would be to recognize that it's not actually your job to take care of your boss's neuroses, and his opinion of you does not necessarily reflect on your performance or value as a person. It's also helpful to recognize that things in life do happen and exist regardless of what we try to do about them. So for instance, if your boss is going to fire you, they're going to fire you anyway, and you can find a new job. A new job might be actually a better opportunity to work in a new capacity and be more satisfied and fulfilled and less stressed out. So being fired could actually be a blessing, but because you're afraid of it, you don't even consider that and are constantly bothered by stress and anxiety. It's also a better way to recognize that our self-worth is not based on our job or income, but who we are inherently as a person. And being fired is only shameful if you care what other people think. And why should you care what judgmental people think anyway? So that is inventory therapy. This practice is most effective when done daily until it is completed. But being a practice and considering that life never stops happening, it is also a tool to help us live better and more effectively. Very often we experience resentment for the inventory itself and resist doing the practice even when we know we need to do it. Most of us deal with these kinds of hurdles by trying to make ourselves disciplined and consistent, but that reflects an absence of compassion for ourselves and thus is not effective for inventory practice. Of course, none of us wants to do this. Life would be much more enjoyable if we could just ignore things we find inconvenient, and most of us would love to be doing anything other than practices such as inventory. When we experience resistance to the inventory itself, this is because the ego wants to retain control and coping mechanisms, and it is instead helpful in these moments to inventory the inventory. Enter a resentment and related fears to why we resent the inventory and learn compassion for your resistance. That will enable its resolution through compassion, not willpower, so that it is no longer difficult to do. It is also very important to do this practice on paper, written by hand, which communicates with the subconscious, where typing on a keyboard is not as effective. So do it with a pen and paper and not on your computer or phone or tablet. Communication with the unconscious through writing is the reason why journaling is often effective, because writing is the only way we can directly communicate with our unconscious mind. Being structured, the inventory practice accomplishes this more purposefully and directly, and will rapidly help resolve fear and insecurity in direct proportion to the volume of entries. If you would like more instruction and insight into childhood trauma, you can purchase my book, The Perfect Child, at my website, Fuck Portion Control, or natehatch.com. Follow me on social media for updates on my work at the links below the video, and subscribe to the channel to participate in live monthly streams for inventory instruction.